This is Terrible Parables, a podcast of Mockingbird Ministries, in which a Bible scholar, a pastor, and an anxious Christian look for some good news and passages of Scripture that are difficult, frightening, or particularly, well, terrible. I'm your host, Callie Yee, and in a little bit I'll be joined by my co-hosts, Todd Brewer and Brian Jarrell. Join us as we find that sometimes the spooky things that go bump in the night are just figments of our imaginations. From Genesis 22. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father, Abraham, "Father," and he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies. And by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. So, what makes this parable so terrible? Or actually, it's not even a parable. It's just a passage.
Just a passage.
What makes it so terrible, Todd?
The murder.
Mm-hmm.
Almost murder. The
almost
Almost murder.
It's our first time in the Old Testament. We do need to mark that. Yes. This is not a parable. It's our first look into one of the most famous and infamous stories of the whole of the Bible and in the Old Testament proper, right? The binding of Isaac is what it's called. And everybody, it's such a profound story, a profoundly, anxiety producing, terrible story. Like everybody has an opinion on this story and everyone comments on it because it's just so famous. It stands out for that fear that it brings into people, right?
I actually wanted to start off by saying that like this passage of the Bible is like insane to me.
Say
It's
more.
a little insane. I don't know. I'm so curious. I want to know. I want to know, like, how does Isaac feel about the fact that, like,
Yeah, because Isaac's not young.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then there is some sort of reaction that he's having to what's going on. And I'm just curious what he was thinking, because I know what I would think if that happened to me. But
what would you think?
I would be like, my father is insane. And I'd probably leave. I'd probably be like, peace out. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, people who believe God told them to, murder are usually committed to asylums and things.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, at least in the modern time. I mean, if you look at the ancient world, one of the things that pops up in ancient religions, like human sacrifice was a thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like just undeniably, we know that. You look at the Mesoamerican cultures, like the Inca, Maya, Aztec, like those communities. There's ritual sacrifice of human beings. We have, Carthage is famously described as a city where they were sacrificing their children to the gods. And, the question about human sacrifice, it's in the air in ancient religion. And that's part of what I think, as it's the book of Genesis, as we're getting to know the God of the Bible. I mean, there is a question like, well, what if the God who called you, if you're Abraham, out of your land and brought you to a new land and you've got years of relationship with, what if that God asked you to do something like that? What would you do? And it's a question that is brought forward for a lot of us.
But I'm also like curious, like, why God would ask that of Abraham. Like, that doesn't seem like the good God that I believe in.
When I was in a large evangelical youth group growing up, it was certainly more concerned, to paraphrase Kennedy, it wasn't about what God could do for me, it's what I could do for God. Mm-hmm. It's kind of the vibe of things. And they gave us all as an exercise 5 index cards and told us to write the 5 most important things in our life on these index cards. And of course, you're in Sunday school, so one of them's God, and then it's like your family, and then you'd fill in the rest with school or your sports, a boyfriend, right?
Yeah.
And then the teacher was like, okay, well, now you can only have 4 of them. Which one are you going to give away?
Oh.
Which one can you be without? And everyone go through and they go, well, I guess I'll get rid of sports. It's like, okay, now you can only have 3 of them. Which one are you going to give away?
The boyfriend.
And it might have been the boyfriend, right?
Dime a dozen.
But the idea was to try to get you to think about your priorities in life, this, that, or the other. And I walked away from it feeling like, if God asked me to give things up like this, things that he says are good and right and true and part of a normal life, like I have some real questions about God more than me in that regard.
Yeah.
And I remember that 20 years some odd later because of the anxiety of like, is God going to ask me to give up something in my life, right? I mean, I have my 2 kids. I have a 5-year-old, my son named Tom, and my 2-year-old Audrey. And I do think this parable, the story changes, when you have kids, because then you're like, oh, like now I actually have a kid, and what if God asked me to do the same thing? Mm-hmm. And it's certainly this litmus test that has fascinated theologians and people in the church, and even the Jewish community too. You can look at their writings on the subject, and they have their thoughts on it, because it's this question, right? The ultimate question of what can you give to God and not what God has given to you.
Yeah. What do you think, Todd?
Yeah, I think this generally connects to a kind of broader depiction of God that you find elsewhere, like in Job, for example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? Job loses his entire family due to some kind of cosmic bet between God and the devil, or the accuser, without imputing a later name. Mm-hmm. And Job attributes this to God. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of picture of God from this text and elsewhere that is fairly popular, of a kind of divine ruler in the heavens who pushes the smite button occasionally as a means of testing people's faith. Mm-hmm. Someone who is capricious, random, and asks of people impossible things, just like Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
It's that great, that nobody sings it anymore now. I think we've gotten over ourselves on this one, but there was that popular Christian song in a lot of evangelical circles from a few years ago, blessed be the name of the Lord, right? That was the Job verse was the chorus.
Matt Redman.
You give and take away, my heart will choose to stay. And, I had a buddy of mine who was going through cancer in college. I mean, he chemo, no hair. I mean, trying to do college and chemo at the same time. He loved that song. It gave him a lot of, perspective, but at the same time, I was kind of like, well, if he can take away all these other things, what else can he take away?
Mm-hmm.
And will he take away his love or his care or his grace or his forgiveness? I mean, that vision of a capricious God is not one that strikes me as particularly comforting or, there's not a lot of, what's the good news there?
Matt Redman, if you are a listener, I'm still a fan, even if Brian is not.
I didn't say I wasn't a fan of Matt Redman. It's just that particular song seems to be,
whenever I've played that song, it has a great palm mute on the chords. It's amazing. I'm really good at playing that song.
Todd's secret background is an evangelical worship leader coming through.
So it's not so much that you love the song; it's that you love that you can play the song well.
And he looks really good in skinny jeans.
And Matt Redman's vocal range is comparable to my own. It's not like some Chris Tomlin crap where the chorus is ridiculously high and the verses are ridiculously low. So
it's for you personally, Todd.
I'm just want to defend
just to clarify.
Matt Redman's good name.
It's not Matt Redman, it's just a song. But that's the anxiety, right? Like if it's not a son, a literal son for you, well, what is it, right? Like what is the thing? Mm-hmm. And we can go back and forth about whether or not God, in sort of his care disciplines us and sort of takes away things that are bad from us that we love. But like, it's a kid. Like this is a whole higher level. Like we're not talking about loving, caring discipline of any sort. We're talking about like God's promise, right? God promised a son to Abraham, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the child of the promise.
I mean, it also
right?
like Abraham's wife Sarah didn't conceive until old age.
Exactly.
So this is like Isaac is a huge blessing.
This is the miracle child born out of a promise that God had made, half a century before. And the whole of Genesis really is this question of, Abraham trusting, but God saying, just trust me. And Abraham going, well, we're getting old. Like what's going on here? And so, it's not just a matter of even, yes, it's the child, but it's the promise with the child. Like God says, I'm going to bless you and give you 1 million descendants. And here's the first. Oh, wait, you need to give me that back. And it's like, I almost feel bad for Abraham in some sense. This is why Abraham's better than me, because he passes a test that I wouldn't.
This is how you know Brian is a father, because he identifies with Abraham rather than Isaac.
Yeah.
Callie identifies with Isaac.
Yes.
Brian identifies with Abraham.
Dad, what are you doing?
I identify with God, of course.
Well, I mean, you did brag about your Matt Redman abilities.
Guitar skills.
Scholars often do identify themselves in that way.
Burn.
Yeah, this is
We're the one-eyed man in the land of the blind.
That's
the
right.
Scholars are. We all get together in our conferences and we just talk about how much other people are idiots. It's true.
Right.
It's what happens every year.
But yeah, I mean, we don't have to. We could spend a lot of time talking about the layers of why this parable is so terrible. But most readers who read this are going to think, "Oh, this is tough." Like we don't have to do a lot of explaining why it's a terrible parable, just because on its face value.
So to go back to the thing I first said, the murder.
Mm-hmm.
So the other reason why this is so terrible is like, how can a God who commands people later to not murder command Abraham to?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the distinction between a sacrifice and murder is an important one.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, how can God ask Abraham to kill his son?
Right.
Yeah.
When he says, "Thou shalt not kill."
But it also feels like a clear distinction between like Old Testament God and New Testament God. But they're the same God.
Oh yeah.
No, I know that there's
right.
Okay.
Calm down. I know that it's the same God, but
She's not a Marcionite.
it is difficult to understand who God
No, but
is
this-
in light of both the
To-
Old and the New Testament.
To the Marcionite point, that this is actually one of the kind of texts that Marcion
Yeah.
read
Right.
and was like,
Who's Marcion?
Marcion
Yeah.
was sorry.
Yeah.
Marcion was a 2nd century heretic,
Yeah.
deemed to
Okay.
be
Like
so.
one of the first big heretics in the church, like one of the first big guys to come out with a theology.
and probably the
Okay.
most significant
Yeah.
in all of church history.
Why was he a heretic?
So he was a heretic because he believed that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament are two different gods.
And they're not. Once again, I want to say this.
And they're not.
I do not believe
Right.
they are. But
Yeah,
it's hard to understand.
Yeah.
right.
Like Marcion's the guy who's famous for this whole the God of the Old Testament sort of judgy and mean and vicious and there's no love and he's angry and vindictive, and the God of the New Testament's love and all the happy joyful things. And so ditch the Old Testament and keep Luke's gospel is basically what Marcion said.
Luke's gospel, 10 of Paul's epistles.
Yes.
And even then, Marcion believed that the texts that he had were corrupted by a kind of Judaizing influence in the church.
So then he wouldn't have liked Matthew then.
Oh no, he wouldn't have
Yeah.
liked Matthew.
Yeah.
He only thought Luke was legitimate,
Right.
and even that was an edited version of Luke.
Yeah.
And so this we might say, right, this parable is so terrible that like people want to just ditch this part of the Bible altogether when they read part.
Well,
of it,
and many
right?
people do.
Yeah.
So that's the thing is like Marcion was never really defeated. He just kind of went underground.
Right.
And so you often find today it's very interesting. It's a very ecumenical position to contrast the God of the Old Testament with the God of the New Testament.
What
you
is
find
ecumenical?
Ecumenical. It's everyone can agree with it across the kind of spectrum.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Makes sense.
hardline conservatives can say this, like people who went to Baptists who went to Bible college will say this, and liberal mainline churches will say this as well. They'll all
Okay.
contrast.
They're all in agreement.
The God of judgment of the Old Testament and the God of grace in the New Testament.
Yeah.
And in many ways, that's why getting this passage right is important, because getting it right is how you thread the needle to affirm that this is one and the same God, and you can't separate the two testaments. So how is this?
Yeah.
Not
How is
so
it
terrible?
not so terrible?
How is this parable not so terrible then?
Yeah. How is this passage not as insane as it feels like it is?
Well, it kind of is.
Well, it's still insane, but like,
No, so the key thing for me is to read it as part of a broader Genesis narrative.
Right.
okay.
So that's the first thing. In other words, this isn't the pathos of the story isn't simply that Isaac is Abraham's son, but rather that Isaac is the child of promise.
Right.
Okay.
So what's at stake here is much more is more than father-son anxiety and dynamics, but rather it has to do with the nature of the promise given to Abraham.
Covenant.
In Genesis 12 and
15,
Genesis 15, Genesis 17,
Right.
and reaffirmed here at the end of Genesis 22. So the promise is front and center for this passage, and so that's the first thing to recognize. I think a lot of this this passage really has to do with the nature of Abraham's faith. And so it's a test, so to speak, that for the reader is not meant to be necessarily mimicked in a one-to-one scenario.
Right.
Right? You're not meant to take your son and travel up to a random mountain and see if God will stop your hand.
Yeah.
Right? It's meant to evoke something about the nature of faith illustratively through Abraham. And so the command of God to sacrifice the child of promise demands that Abraham's faith rest not on its tangible manifestation, but rather on the promise alone. So that Abraham doesn't have any kind of inherent intuitive claim to the promise, but rather God's promise comes to Abraham and is given to Abraham solely on the basis of what God says, rather than any kind of manifestation in worldly success or anything like that.
Yeah.
So does Abraham believe in the promise, or does Abraham believe in the child that has been given?
Okay.
And the key sort of part of the verse, so when at the very end he bound him, and the angel of the Lord calls and he says, "For now I know that you fear God." Now, this term fear isn't fear as in like cowering and afraid, as we might think of in terms of the parable of the talents. This fear is a kind of Hebrew idiom for having faith.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's that kind of fear, as in like, I'm going to live my life in the recognition that God exists and like work around that.
Like a reverence?
Reverence, awe, respect. Like God exists and I don't want to make him mad, versus cowering in the corner. God exists and I want to like actually live my life in that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Not so much I don't want to make him mad, but rather it's literally just an idiom for faith.
Yeah.
How we talk about faith.
Yeah.
Is
that's right.
The Hebrew idiom for I know that you fear God.
But I feel
fear the Lord and lean not on your own understanding.
The other way to look, the other way to sort of lean on this too, is to recognize like, well, what is Abraham's faith in? Because at some point he says, Isaac says like, he notices there's no sacrifice. He's like, Dad, there's no sacrifice here. Like, what's going on? And Abraham says, God will provide the sacrifice. And commentators of all stripes and sorts have sort of looked at that to say, well, there's a faith here that Abraham kind of is going through the motions and he knows there's something else going on behind the scenes. And in fact, if you go to the book of Hebrews, right, what's the New Testament commentary on this passage? The New Testament commentary on this passage is from Hebrews 11, here's 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. And so the New Testament commentary on this passage is to say Abraham's faith here is that God is going to do something beyond the actual obvious act of the murder of the child, right? And so for the New Testament, it's like Abraham even believed in the resurrection of the dead. And this is why Christians in general, the early church was very big on this, and it's been the case, have said the best analogy for understanding what's happening in Genesis 22 is not our Father and Son dynamics, but God the Father and God the Son and Jesus' death and resurrection. And so this is a way of reading the Bible called typology, right? This idea that things line up so well in the story of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac that there's so many parallels to what happens in Jesus' death and resurrection, even to the point of like Isaac carrying his own wood to the mount in which he will be sacrificed. Where Isaac is offered as a sacrifice is where the temple will eventually be built and Jerusalem is founded. And so this idea that the best way to think about this passage is to say Abraham plays this sort of great drama of salvation history of God the Father and God the Son. He plays that out way before it happens to its fullest in the Gospels.
But I'm also just curious about this language of like testing Abraham and testing his faith. And so I feel like in a lot of church sermons, I've heard like applications about like God will test your faith, and it is almost like up to you to have a strong enough faith to like pass that test.
Yeah, I don't like to make a kind of sharp distinction between God how we might think of God's presence and how we might think of God's absence.
Okay.
So testing is usually associated with God's absence.
Mm-hmm.
And Luther talked extensively about this as an Anfechtung is the German word, as a test or trial, temptation. And I think if you construct your God in such a way that God has two different modes of being, one of testing and one of benevolence, then you're left with a kind of schizophrenic, two-faced God. And I would sort of instead push our experience of God's absence is a time when we are faced with the question of what kind of faith will we have? Will we have faith in that God's blessing and God's goodness is tied immediately to our worldly circumstances, or whether it is tied to God himself? I think that's a real thing, but I wouldn't put it as like God is this kind of, I don't know, like a boxer who jabs us with goodness, and then sometimes jabs us with trials and temptations.
But that's how it feels sometimes.
I know, experientially, that's how it feels.
And then, so how do we?
But I think the kind of to hold both of those together is to say that the God who is redeeming the world that's the ultimate telos of whatever our up and down experience is. In other words, it's not a confusion of who God is, but rather it's an acknowledgement of this is our sort of different experience of the here and now, and God is always is
always the same.
Yeah.
I think the other piece of this too is when you look at life as this sort of temptation and trial, and am I going to pass or am I going to fail? Really, there are a number of other instances in the text where Abraham fails in his trust, right? The biggest being, having Isaac with Hagar, right? Like that becomes a great sort of like, I'm trying to take the promises of God on my own. So even if he sort of gets it right here, it doesn't mean he gets it right in other places.
That's true. Yeah.
And so then you read through the Gospels and you're like, well, think about Peter. Peter has a very famous failure of a test, right? To sort of be with Jesus throughout his crucifixion. And then he denies Jesus 3 times. The only person to sort of go through the fullness of sort of these testing moments in Scripture and come out the other side a winner is Jesus. And, he's tempted by Satan a number of times, right? He's at the beginning of his ministry. There's other moments where he's praying to have is this the only way? Take this cup from me, God. And God's like, no, we're going to keep going through it. This idea that Christ himself becomes the one who is tested and succeeds, right? I mean, it takes some of the pressure off to realize that everyone else in the Bible has failed. And we should just sort of like include and recognize that we're going to fail a lot, but God is merciful and good and true and right.
You look like you have thoughts, John.
Yeah. I don't know. Something about the Jesus juke to jump to Jesus is like a little too neat. I think I'm bothered by the wood mostly.
The wood is just the sort of one piece of it. Like the early church fathers, a lot of other Christians have really gotten they get a lot of mileage.
Well,
out
yeah,
of it.
but the church fathers say some ridiculous things.
They do.
A lot of ridiculous things. Origen is famous for saying lots of ridiculous things about how to interpret Scripture. And yes, I understand that Origen is motivated by a sense in which God is all in all, and therefore all of Scripture points to God. And great, glad for you, Origen. But that doesn't mean
he's right all the time.
It's necessarily a responsible way of interpreting Scripture.
Right.
To use a kind of modern idiom, that'll preach, but it's not a good reading.
It's tough because the overlap does seem to be like so close that. I'm not one to sort of go the Jesus juke way either. It just seems like this is one of those cases where it seems almost inviting in the text to do so. Like people will say things like God was walking with Adam and Eve in the garden. And they'll be like, oh, that was Jesus walking with them in the garden. And I'm like, Well, maybe. Like, I don't want to build any theological principles off of that.
Yeah.
But the flip side of that is here, this the only promised son who is the key to the savior, the saving of the world and this sort of thing. It's hard not to draw some parallels.
Yes. The God who did not spare his only begotten son.
Correct. Right.
Yes.
Which is why I think when I try to summarize this text in like one sentence, like if I were to boil it down to somebody, I'd say the point of this would be God gave up his own son so you don't have to, is kind of the thing that I would summarize, because it shifts the dynamic from saying, again, as opposed to what do I owe God? What has God given for me? And all of the sort of questioning that goes in behind this text resolves itself in the giving sort of love of God through, again, his only begotten son.
Yeah. And I would.
What would your like elevator pitch?
I wouldn't go to Christology. I would go to anthropology, the other side, which is that life isn't cheery all the time. God isn't all sunsets and rainbows, and the life of faith is lived amid the ups and downs of life. And the question then is whether you affirm the goodness of God when God appears to be hidden. And what that looks like isn't this kind of rote, formulaic thing, but rather it's, I know who God is irrespective of whatever my circumstances are. Because God is God, it was manifested in the person of Jesus, right? I do go to who God is Jesus, and who Jesus is one who has redeemed and will redeem the world, right? But the experience of everyday life, it does not map onto many of the kind of highfalutin, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, fruit of the Spirit, right? And so this passage for me is important because it shows that faith isn't all sunsets and rainbows, and that God isn't just there for when things are isn't just present when things are good, but also present in the very happening when things are terrible.
But I'm still like questioning about it, because it's not so much like in this passage that God is hidden, but also that like God commands Abraham to do the thing that will bring him pain.
But
I
think what Todd's trying to say is the hiddenness is, why is God asking me to do this?
Yeah.
Right? Like the why is what is hidden.
Hiddenness is revelation.
Okay.
So it's all revelation. It's all the same God. And the terribleness is, I find the terribleness of this text, I find to be resonant with the terribleness of life.
Okay.
That God isn't just there to bless people with good things, but he's also there in the midst of bad things.
And in things we don't understand.
Yes.
And Abraham definitely didn't understand this.
He does not understand this, right?
So
I think the other piece of this too that's worth mentioning, this sense of, there is a figure in the Bible, right, who does lose their son in this very terrible sacrifice and doesn't get spared in the last moment. And that's Mary. Mary is a really interesting foil here, I think, because, Hebrews says, right, like Abraham kind of metaphorically loses his son but gets him back. And Mary kind of fills that same role in the New Testament as well, right? It's her son who dies on the cross, and she kind of gets him back at the end, right? It's different, the resurrected Jesus. But, the difference being Jesus goes through the sacrifice and Mary has to sort of bear that burden, right? For her to offer up her only son. She becomes this sort of New Testament parallel here. And she is sort of in the same boat, right? She has to trust God in the midst of her own confusion, in the midst of her own unknowing and mystery. she has to sort of go through the whole process and watch it happen. She's there for the very, very hard act of the crucifixion.
Yeah.
And she has to witness it. And from the very beginning, God was like, this is going to be a sword that pierces your heart. And yet through her faith, right, she does become, right, this figure who she gets her son back. And so that kind of what part of what Todd's saying to tag on to that is to say, there are lots of crazy hard things that happen in life, and there are plenty of parents out there who've lost kids who are asking, why God, why? And this text brings up those questions, and there is a sense of why God, why? We're not sure. And this fits into this greater context of, well, Jesus' death and resurrection is something so compelling, we can still trust God even when the hard things happen.
The article I have is Andrea Pitzer's for The Atlantic. It's called The Exciting Business Opportunity That Ruined Our Lives. It was written in January of this year, and in it, Pitzer details her family's tragic experience with a multi-level marketing scheme by the name of Amway. Do you all know Amway?
I was once recruited to try to sell for Amway.
Oh.
Yeah, very interesting. But
Yeah.
Continue the story.
I only really know Amway because the Orlando Magic Arena is named after Amway.
Is it
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Orlando is their headquarters, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Oh, okay. I've never heard of Amway until now. But anyway, for those who are unfamiliar with it, Amway sells health, beauty, and home care products. And you can sign up, purchase a number of products, and supposedly make a profit off of selling those products to families and friends. It's a classic multi-level marketing scheme. For some Americans, joining the business might have been harmless. For us, it was not. Soon, my mother and stepfather had no other job. Their bad decisions ricocheted in the echo chamber of Amway culture, where they were encouraged to dedicate themselves more deeply. Surely, any day now, we would make it. Within 3 years, we were living in a filthy house without electricity, eating food out of a cooler that was kept filled with ice. Then we were evicted, and my mother and stepfather declared bankruptcy. Ordinary people might have thought twice about sticking with Amway, but by that point, we had left the small dreams of ordinary people behind. She continues, in the years that followed, my mother and I would sometimes talk about real life, a birth, a death, a grandchild, and flashes of who she used to be would shine through. But she always sounded a little embarrassed by the things she said, as if she understood that they were hard to believe. I think she wanted me to see that she knew that the most cult-like aspects of the business were over the top, that she hadn't been taken in entirely, that she wasn't some kind of fool. But it didn't matter. In the end, Amway owned her as fully as if she'd believed every word. Despite interventions my brother and I attempted, despite the money she continued to lose year after year, our mother never gave up on the business.
I like, Callie, that you picked this article because we tend to think of these things about sacrificing our children for a greater good as being old and ancient. And, what this was an opportunity to look into was from a child's perspective of, sort of being sacrifice left behind as someone went after the god of wealth or the god of mammon, right? The Bible talks about that and how the children sort of offered up in that way. You don't like my metaphor here, Todd?
Todd doesn't like metaphors.
No, I'm just imagining the sermon of like, what have you pursued to sacrifice what have you sacrificed your children for?
To pursue.
Like, imagine that on the billboard. What if you sacrificed your children?
That would bring people in.
Bring
for sure.
people in. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
That's a clickbait worthy title right there.
Can I confess something to you both? I sold kitchen cutlery as a part of something.
Pampered Chef?
No, not Pampered Chef.
Okay.
Are you familiar with the joys of Cutco kitchen
yes.
cutlery?
Oh,
Aren't
Cutco.
those knives really good?
That's the saving grace is if you're going to get caught up in sort of a, salesman, sort of prosperity themed multi-level marketing scheme. It's like on the borderline there. then Cutco's at least the good one
Okay.
because you can keep the knives and they're pretty good.
How much
under-
money did you make through your Cutco?
I made
Sales.
it was a summer job, so I was in college. I found and Cutco they love to recruit college kids, and so I got in, did the training, got the sample kit, and I made enough money to hang out in college. I mean, it wasn't great money, but that summer when I went home from college, I made a lot of money, and I made a lot of money. I think I sold about $10,000 worth of Cutco, and I probably kept about half of it, which is really good for a summer job for college, and helped pay for a missions trip I took the next summer to China. But
Wow.
but I know. Here's the thing: in that world, the reason I left it behind was because it was very much about this gospel of prosperity, try harder, do better. And then you sold a lot. And then what was the next level after you sold a lot? It was recruiting other people to sell under you, that you took a chunk of their profits and kept selling as well. And everything that, I mean, of course, I didn't get involved to the point where it was detrimental to my life. But at some point you had to realize this is for part-time college students and people looking to make a little extra cash on the side. It is not the way to wealth, or even better, it's not the way to sort of middle-class stable living. And they'd take you to these conferences, and these conferences would have motivational speakers. It was a really weird world. And they kept trying to push this idea that the more, and this is why this is relevant, the more you sacrificed to this job, the closer you would get to wealth and prosperity and all your dreams coming true.
Right. So for me, what this article really raises is it's the difference between the theology of the cross and the theology of glory,
Yeah.
and how both account for suffering, and how both account for loss and difficulties of life. Because the theology of glory will say this is instrumental suffering on the way to something better.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's so in this way, demands and testings and all those kinds of things are extracting from the person in order to that there might be something better along the way. It provides motivation, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is how cults work, by the way. But that's a theology of glory.
Right.
A theology of the cross says that God is with you in the suffering, and it's not instrumental towards some greater glory down the road.
Right.
Yeah.
In other words, God is there in the suffering. God isn't there. God isn't sort of using your suffering to make you better.
The suffering isn't for some end.
Yeah. It's not a means to an end.
The thing that, it's the sense of, in this article that we read, it is that sense of that maniacally driven direction towards something bad for you, that it's the carrot being dangled in front of you that you shoot for at the expense of everything else. And that is the test of these things. They want you to keep giving more, and they give you more, they give you more. And to go back to my little index card thing from, like I said earlier, you could just as easily see somebody in a multi-level marketing scheme saying, here's your index cards. What are you willing to give up for success? What are you willing to give up for wealth? What are you willing to give up to be a winner? What are you willing to give up to be your own boss and to tell everybody else to go sit on attack and to, and they have all of these things for you, and they keep saying, what are you willing to give up? And in this instance, it really does seem like, from the daughter's perspective, who's writing this piece, her parents did give up everything, including her and her welfare, and her brother's welfare, and it's heartbreaking, right? It's really heartbreaking stuff to see it happen.
In search of this false promise of the American dream.
Yeah.
But even if the promise wasn't false, I think she'd still be writing this article.
Yeah.
Okay.
What happened if the she made the money, right? Down the road she was successful and made the money. And this article would still be here because it still came.
That's true.
At the expense of her kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes a lot of people. So in Kings, the book of Kings, before Samuel coronates Saul. Before Samuel coronates Saul, he gives this warning about about kings. You don't want a king because kings will take and will take and will take and will
Yeah.
take and
Yeah.
will take. And I always think of that whenever people emphasize the sort of kingship of God as a kind of divine king, because it always raises the question to me of what kind of king.
Mm.
Is this a king in a Saul kind of way?
Mm-mm.
Mhm.
A king who demands obedience and requires of us and takes and takes,
Mm-hmm.
or is this a different kind of king who has come to serve and not be served?
I want to go back to what was it? Oh, Todd, what you were saying about the theology of glory. I there was an article I read a while ago for The Weekender, and it was how the theology of glory is sometimes for certain demographics of people is comforting, because this idea that there's a reason for why I'm suffering because there's some means to an end. I don't agree with it, but
Yeah.
Somewhere in this text, right, the theology of glory is screwing up our interpretation of the text.
like the theology of glory is almost like dealing with the question of theodicy, of why evil exists in the world, why good things happen to, or bad things happen to good people, the question of why God allows suffering. The theology of glory can sometimes, I could see how it would feel almost comforting at times.
Well, it gets God off the hook.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
Ferdy phrase. Is
Mhm.
it?
Yeah.
The theology of glory is always trying to get God off the hook.
Yes. And I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. It helps me grapple with questioning God's goodness. Yeah.
Have you ever been in a place, Callie, where like you were in a church situation where they kept trying to like get you to that again, that framework of like, what can you do for God versus more of what has God done for you?
Yes.
Like what does that look like for you in churches in the past? Like in that experience in your life, like how has that been communicated to you?
There was a lot of talk about like what are various idols that we have in our lives. So, so like friends that we put above God, or or other things that we put above God, like our accomplishments, or if we're doing well in school or something like that. Like, what are the other so-called gods in our lives that we're putting above the one true God?
One of the things that's so challenging about this parable is it takes something natural and good and beautiful, right? Like a kid,
Mm-hmm.
but also the promise of God. And it says, give it up, like hold it with loose hands. It's like, like, and going back to that capriciousness of God of give and take and this, that, or the other. And it's like, why can't I just enjoy the good thing that God has given me?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why does everything have to be why do I have to what is everything that good that God has given me then get turned into a test about whether I love it too much or love it too little? I mean, that's where you get into the theology of glory, right? Because then it becomes this sense of self-improvement almost to pass these tests and to grow closer to God and be closer to God, when God's just like, here's a gift, enjoy it.
I just think asking people what their idols are, as if that doing so is somehow helpful,
It's not helpful.
it is like a self-defeating exercise. Yeah. I think I try when it comes to questions like this, I try not to take the terms of the question as it's been handed to me by the worst of interpreters. I just rather not ask the question about what our idols are and what they're not, and say we all live in a world and we're all trying to make the best of what we have, and what we know to be true about God exists independently of whether things or whether our idols are blessing us or not blessing us at the time.
Yes.
In other words, faith, like the solution to not faith, the absence of faith, which is what idolatry is not to point at the
Yes.
idolatry.
Yes.
But to point at something beyond the idolatry, which moves one's desires toward it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
I fully agree with
so the
that.
question of what are you idolatrous about, and let's talk this through and have a one-to-one and heart-to-heart, and like let's really have some discipleship sessions or whatever. Like it all presumes we're rational people who can like choose different desires, and aren't irrational people who are moved by desires and moved by good things towards good things. If God is so good, he doesn't have to like crap on all your idols in order to be good.
Yeah.
And it also presumes in our reading that Isaac is an idol, which is not the case.
Isaac is
at
not
all.
an idol. Isaac is
not
the
an
child
idol.
of promise.
Right. He's a child of promise.
Right.
So there is a sense where talk about another terrible reading of the parable. Isaac is an idol.
Thank you for listening to Terrible Parables. You can find us on the web at ember.com. Audio production for Terrible Parables is provided by TJ Hester. Please leave us a rating or review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. We hope you've had a not so terrible time.